Welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Sunday, September 7th, 2025, and thank you for joining me while I talk to myself about number one Ohio State's 70-0 obliteration of Grambling State in the Horseshoe yesterday. Now, I said this back in the summer when we looked at the schedule. I just don't understand the point of scheduling FCS opponents, especially bad ones. I mean, who benefits from playing a game like this? It's certainly not the fans who paid hundreds of dollars to go to that game yesterday. I guess maybe you could say Ohio State reserves benefited from it. I mean, they were able to play extensively in the second half, and a bunch of them actually looked really good. More on that in a minute. I guess you could certainly say Grambling Athletics benefits. I mean, Ohio State cut them a check for $1 million to take that ass whooping yesterday. And I suppose there's some value in opening up the playbook for Julian Sain for the first time in his career in a live game setting and letting him make all the throws. We know Sain has the ability, and at this stage, it's just about really building his confidence and gaining experience in a live game setting. So there's value there. But I would argue that all of that still could have been accomplished by scheduling a decent group of five opponent in this slot, or maybe even a Power 4 opponent instead of Grambling State. Because it's just hard to know what's real coming out of a game like this. You know, it's hard to know what's transferable from this game to when Ohio State starts playing real teams again, which won't be for another few weeks, though Parker Navarro and the Ohio University Bobcats might have something to say about that. They're actually playing pretty well, probably better than 8 or 9 Big Ten teams right now. The Buckeyes face the Bobcats next Saturday under the lights in the Horseshoe, and that could end up being a real test, at least for the Ohio State defense. So as I like to do on Sundays, I'm going to tick down a short list of takeaways from yesterday's performance. As always, I'm going to assume you watched and you know what happened in this game, so I'm not going to cover every single play. Let's start with Julian Sain because, look, at the end of the day, it's really his continued growth and maturation that will determine the ceiling for the 2025 Ohio State Buckeyes. Now, coming into this game, I wanted to see a continuation of what we saw from Sain against Texas, which was processing things quickly, accuracy, and, of course, limiting mistakes. But, of course, with a lot more production and explosiveness out of the passing game than what we saw against Texas. And that's exactly what we got yesterday. We also did see a teachable moment in the only pass Sain didn't complete to one of his teammates, which was the second quarter interception by Grambling defensive back Terrell Raby at the Grambling 1-yard line. Sain was a little late on the throw. He threw it behind Carnell Tate, and Raby stepped in front of the ball for the easy pick. But to my untrained eye, that was the only blemish on an otherwise perfect afternoon for the young quarterback. In only 32 snaps, Sain completed his first 15 passes of the day, finishing 18 of 19 for 306 yards, 4 touchdown passes, and the pick. Sain threw touchdown passes of 47 yards to tight end Will Kazmarek, 87 yards and 9 yards to Jeremiah Smith, and 13 yards to Carnell Tate, which, by the way, was the best catch of the afternoon. Tate is off to a great start so far this season. And I think he's starting to make his own case for the Biletnikoff Award. A lot of people, and rightfully so, were just ready to kind of hand the award to Jeremiah Smith. And it's ironic because Smith's biggest competition for that award might very well be his own teammate, Carnell Tate. He's off to a fantastic start so far this season. Now, the PFF grades are still being tabulated, but according to them, the Grambling defense did not record a single pressure on Julian Sain, so we do have to take that into account as we weigh his performance yesterday. But we do have his performance against an excellent Texas defense with a lot of NFL players last week as part of the overall evaluation. And I think if you put the two together, there's very good reason to be excited about the trajectory of the Ohio State offense with Sain at the controls. The arm talent is obvious. I mean, Sain's throws are accurate. They're on time. They're almost always with a feathery touch. He throws a very catchable football. Very similar to C.J. Stroud. And maybe after 2 games, it's a little unfair to make that comparison, but it's hard not to because there's a lot of similarities just in terms of the arm talent and the way that Sain delivers the football. Now, again, I know we're only 2 games in, but I think it's time we have a serious conversation about James Peoples and Bo Jackson. I mentioned this both Sunday and in our preview pod on Thursday. I thought Peoples' struggles in the opener against Texas might have opened the door for the true freshman Jackson to start getting some carries. Now, I'm not sure that's how the coaching staff felt, because C.J. Donaldson and Peoples were the only two Ohio State backs to get carries in the first half when the game was, relatively still in doubt. Bo Jackson didn't get his first carry until midway through the third quarter with Ohio State up 42-0, and that turned out to be an 11-yard touchdown run right through the heart of the Grambling defense that to me just looked different from anything we've seen from the Ohio State running game so far. That put the Buckeyes up 49-zip. Jackson also had runs of 16 yards and 51 yards in the fourth quarter, and he finished the day as the game's leading rusher with 108 yards on 9 carries and the touchdown. Now, I know it was late in the fourth quarter against a worn-down Grambling State defense, but that 51-yard touchdown run by Jackson showed me everything I needed to see. He is far and away the most explosive running back on this roster. And I think he has to be RB2 behind C.J. Donaldson. Jeremiah Smith had an interesting quote about Jackson in the postgame. He said, quote, "That's the guy right there. I've been saying it since spring. Bo Jackson is next up for sure. He's a tough running back. Fast. I mean, he can do it all," end quote. And look, I agree with Smith. That's what my eyes told me watching the spring game. And that's what I saw yesterday as well. Jeremiah Smith, by the way, doing Jeremiah Smith things. In only 29 snaps, Smith finished with 5 catches, 119 yards, and 2 touchdown catches. Look, James Peoples was fine yesterday, 59 yards on 8 carries, but his longest run of the day was only 12 yards. And look, Peoples is only going to get you the yardage that the play was designed to get. Right? If it's drawn up for 5 yards, that's what it'll get you. If it's drawn up for 3 yards, that's what it'll get you. In 49 carries last season, Peoples only averaged 4 yards per carry. So far this season, it's 4.4 yards per carry. And I just don't think that's good enough. And I'm just not seeing great vision or acceleration from Peoples. He doesn't seem to have much in his toolbox to make that first tackler miss. And he doesn't really seem to do much after contact either. And again, I have an untrained eye when it comes to this sort of thing. I'm just a fan watching from 2,500 miles away. But, all those attributes that I just described, I'm sorry to say, are part of the job description for an Ohio State running back. That's just life in the big city, as Urban Meyer famously said. Personally, I think it's just a matter of time before Bo Jackson moves into that RB2 role. I think he's just too good to keep off the field this season. And the Ohio State offense does need to be explosive in the run game. And Jackson looks like the only back that can deliver that. Now, again, it's early, but I'm also mildly concerned about Brandon Inniss. I think we can say this much at this stage, that as a slot receiver, Inniss is several notches below his predecessors, Emeka Egbuka and Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's smaller and not quite as athletic or as fast as Egbuka and Smith-Njigba. And there were 2 plays against Texas in particular where I remember thinking Emeka Egbuka would have made that play. The first was a drop pass, which I think might have been Julian Saint's best throw of the afternoon against Texas. I think it probably would have gone for about 25 yards and a first down. Would not have been an easy catch, but it's one Emeka Egbuka would have made for sure, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. The other play that I remember was on third down late in the fourth quarter with the Buckeyes nursing a 14-7 lead. Inniss was open on a crosser and made the catch, but could not run the defensive back to the marker, and the Buckeyes had to punt. Again, those were plays that both Emeka Egbuka and Jackson Smith-Njigba made routinely in their careers at Ohio State. And I'm just not seeing that same level of playmaking from Inniss so far this season. Only 7.4 yards per reception on 5 catches so far in this young season. And Brian Hartline, look, he asks a lot of his receivers in the run game as blockers. And so far, Inniss is only grading out at 52.8 in run blocking, according to PFF. I also don't think he's making an impact in the return game either. In fact, I'd say he was a borderline disaster on punt returns yesterday, and he was cut down short of the 20-yard line on the opening kickoff as well. So, again, it's only mild concern at this stage. Inniss is a captain. He's a player that has a lot of respect in the locker room. At the same time, he's in the most talented receiver room in America with players like Bryson Rodgers and Mylan Graham breathing down his neck. There's also tight end Max Clare, who to me looks more like a slot receiver than a tight end. And through 2 games, Clare has been underutilized, I think. Rodgers and Clare are probably players I'd be a little worried about if I'm Innis. So, look, I want to see Innis succeed. He's a good kid, and he's a leader for this team, and I'm hoping he can make more plays for this offense as soon as next Saturday night against the Bobcats. On defense, I was impressed once again by nose tackle Caden McDonald. McDonald, once again, was Ohio State's highest graded defender with an overall grade of 93.6. McDonald forced a third quarter fumble on Grambling running back Byron Eaton Jr. that freshman linebacker Riley Pettijohn scooped up and returned 23 yards for a touchdown. Pettijohn, by the way, he balled out for this defense yesterday. He forced another fumble on Grambling running back Andre Cruz on a perfect form tackle. The future is very, very bright at linebacker for the Buckeyes. Pettijohn looked as good as advertised yesterday. He was one of the young players that really flashed along with Bo Jackson in this game. I also like what I saw from defensive end Caden Curry in limited snaps. In only 25 snaps, Curry finished with a sack and the defense's highest PFF pass rush grade of 79.5 and second highest overall grade of 84.8 behind Caden McDonald. Caleb Downs was also doing Caleb Downs things yesterday. Downs registered his first interception of the season off Grambling starting quarterback Xavier Tset. Downs faked a blitz on the play, then dropped right into Tset's throwing lane to snag the football. That was another Matt Patricia special right there. You wonder how many more times we're going to see that this season. A great defensive call by Patricia, but hey, kudos to Downs for executing on the play. And man, there was a lot of mustard on that football. Great catch by Downs. Downs has great hands, by the way. I'd like to see him go back to returning punts. I think Brandon, like I said before, Innis's days as the punt returner probably are numbered, and my first choice would be Downs to take over those responsibilities. Downs finished with the defense's highest PFF grade for coverage of 88.3. Jake Butt, who's quickly becoming one of my favorite analysts despite where he played his college ball. Jake Butt calls Downs the boogeyman. I think that is a perfect moniker for Downs. I love that nickname for him. Now, one small critique of the defense yesterday, and Jake Butt mentioned this during the telecast, is outside of Caden Curry, the lack of pass rush from the core defensive line. Now, to be fair, the starters and key reserves only played half the game. And actually, I did notice Grambling was often using a sixth offensive lineman for extra pass protection. But Kenyatta Jackson did not have a pressure, according to PFF. Bo Atkinson only had one. It was a weird day for Edric Houston, who had 2 encroachment penalties and then was immediately taken off the field by Larry Johnson both times. In only 10 snaps yesterday, Houston did not record a pressure, and he finished with the defense's lowest overall PFF grade of 29.7 and a dreadful tackling grade of 17.6. It's been a rough start to the 2025 season for Houston. He was injured on the first day of training camp. I assume he's still working his way back from that injury. He was not very effective against Texas, only 3 tackles in that game, and he finished with the defense's worst PFF tackling grade of 28.1. There are better days ahead for Houston. I'm not worried about him, but I'd like to see him get going sooner rather than later, right? I'm going to see him get back on track with a big game against the Bobcats next Saturday night. Look, the lack of pass rush from the front 4 is something Ohio State is going to eventually need to get right, and hopefully sooner rather than later. Because starting this Saturday, they're going to see a pretty good quarterback in Parker Navarro, who's very crafty, also very mobile, and Navarro could give the defense some problems if that front 4 can't get consistent pressure on him. So, look, I mean, finding more explosiveness in the run game and more pressure from the pass rush are what they call champagne problems for an Ohio State squad sitting atop both major polls and looking very much like a legitimate threat to repeat as national champions. There is far more to celebrate than to worry about with this team. Let's be clear about that. They are not playing like a team resting on its laurels. And I would not have been surprised if coming off a huge win over the number 1 team in the country, the Buckeyes looked, a little hungover in the first half against an overmatched opponent. I mean, quite frankly, that's how Penn State looked against FIU yesterday. That's how Clemson looked against Troy. But that was not the case for the Buckeyes yesterday. I mean, they scored touchdowns on 5 of their first 6 possessions. They only punted once in the game, which was in the fourth quarter. They did exactly what they were supposed to do against an opponent like Grambling State. They managed to avoid any injuries and got valuable game reps for many of their young reserves. Now it's onward and upward to what's looking like a much more interesting matchup against the Ohio University Bobcats next Saturday at night in the Horseshoe than many of us anticipated. The Bobcats were 17-10 winners at home over West Virginia, and they nearly knocked off Rutgers in their opener, losing 34-31 in that game. You know, like I said earlier, I think Ohio University is probably better than 8 or 9 Big Ten teams right now. So that should be a fun game to watch on Saturday night. Now, real quick, before I let you go, I have a few thoughts on some of the other results from around the Big Ten, starting with number 15, Michigan's 24-13 loss in Norman to number 18, Oklahoma. Man, I had this game wrong. I thought the Wolverines would find a way to win, but quite frankly, they did not look ready for primetime in this game. And it was a rough night for freshman phenom quarterback Bryce Underwood. Underwood finished 9 of 24 for 142 yards and no touchdowns. Michigan trailed by 2 scores most of the game. They were down 14-zip at the half. But the moment from this game that most people are talking about is a sideline altercation between Underwood and his teammate Justice Haynes. It was caught on camera. Look, that was not a great look for Michigan. And now Sharon Moore will start his 2-week suspension for his role in the sign-stealing scandal that bars him from both practices and coaching in Michigan's next 2 games against Central Michigan in Ann Arbor next Saturday and at Nebraska on September 20th. That game in Lincoln on the 20th is going to be tricky. You've got a very young, inexperienced quarterback without his head coach on the sidelines against a solid opponent in Nebraska. That could be a very tricky game for Michigan. That I would not be surprised if they lose that game as well. Now, look, I still expect Michigan to be playing their best football by the time the Buckeyes see them on November 29th, but it looks like there are going to be a few bumps along the way for the Wolverines. Also in Happy Valley yesterday, I referenced it earlier, I was underwhelmed by Penn State's 34-0 win over Florida International. This was a 10-0 game at the half. Drew Aller was 19 of 33 for 200 yards against a terrible Group of 5 team. People are talking about Andy Kotelnicki like he's this brilliant offensive mind, some sort of savant. And here I look at the box score, and their leading receiver is still a fucking tight end. Only this year it's Luke Reynolds. The Penn State offense, to me, is the same as it ever was, plodding and unimaginative. This is the number 2 team in the country. This game should have been over by halftime, and I'm just not seeing it with this Penn State team. If you listen to this podcast, you know I am highly, highly skeptical of Penn State as a national title contender. I think they're going to make the playoff, but if you're trying to talk me into them being this national title contender, I'm just not buying it right now. And I think they're going to have their hands full in 2 weeks when Oregon comes to town. The number 6 rated Ducks had probably the most impressive win in the country yesterday. They bludgeoned Oklahoma State in Eugene 69-3, 631 yards of total offense for the Ducks. Their quarterback Dante Moore, the UCLA transfer who sat behind Dylan Gabriel last season, sure looks ready to me. Moore was 16 of 21 for 266 yards and 3 touchdown passes. And the Ducks now have their version of Jeremiah Smith and freshman DeCorian Moore, who had a 65-yard touchdown catch in this game. The Oregon ground game steamrolled the Cowboy defense to the tune of 312 yards at 8.4 yards per carry and 5 rushing touchdowns. Oregon had 5 different scrimmage plays of 40-plus yards, and 4 of those were over 50 yards. For some reason, and Kirk Herbstreit was talking about this yesterday during the Michigan-Oklahoma telecast, for some reason, nobody's been talking about Oregon. I mean, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, and even Illinois, who handled their business against Duke yesterday, all those teams have been getting way more attention than the Ducks. I think it's time to sit up and take notice of Dan Lanning's squad. And I think they're going to be a handful for Penn State on September 27th. My early read on that game, and of course I always reserve the right to change my mind, is the Ducks are going to come out of Happy Valley with the win. I don't think the Penn State offense is explosive enough to keep pace with Oregon's offense in that game. All right, that's going to do it for me. Short and sweet. Look for a preview of the Buckeyes and the Bobcats from Paige, Chad, and myself on Thursday evening. Until then, thanks so much for listening, and go Bucks. You've been listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. Follow us on X at South_Stands.